Good morning to everybody here. It's wonderful to be back with you. It was almost an insufferable 12 hours without you, and so it's good to be reconnected with friends interested in gathering for discussing Presbyterian and Reformed public theology. One of the features of this conference that we think is really neat is one that is hosted in a church. It's hosted in a place of worship. Additionally, we have Terrence Little, who is here from McLean Presbyterian Church, a teaching elder there, to open us in a devotional. And so I wanted this afternoon, and so this morning I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to focus our hearts on God's Word before we hear from Jennifer Patterson. Very excited for that. So would you pray for me as we begin with this devotional? Father, we are here before you this morning as your people, recognizing the call that you have placed on our lives to live in this world, to be members extending the transforming power of your kingdom to the ends of the earth, recognizing the different roles that the church and the state play, recognizing as well that you have called us to yourself and that first and foremost have redeemed us from sin and have called us your sons and daughters to live in obedience to you. And so we love you and give you this time in your name. Amen. Our text for our devotional this morning is from Galatians 4, Galatians 4, verses 1 through 7. I'm going to read that for us. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through God. In opening this devotional, there are a number of different illustrations that could be used as we begin. Maybe something like Oliver Twist from Charles Dickens, an orphan abandoned to the streets of London trying to find his way. Maybe something a little older like the Odyssey as Telemachus searches for his identity to figure out who he is and is waiting for his father to return. Something like maybe a TV show or a movie, Broadway, Annie, who is America's favorite orphan, in fact. And then thinking through the possible options, none of them, as I was thinking, seem to fit well with this time. And given the deeply intimate and personal way we think about our families, or in the case of orphans, potential lack thereof, the chance of using a clumsy metaphor seemed ill-advised. As a result, there is no opening illustration. But our focus in this brief time is going to be on the implications of following God's law in the light of adoption. As we read this passage, I think it's fair to say that there is something sensitive about this topic. Adoption implies, of course, the reality of orphans. As a child, I remember this being a very scary prospect. And while maybe not as scary as an adult, it does move, and I'm sure moves all of our hearts. Abandonment and isolation are not part of God's original creation. They are foreign invaders that resulted from the fall. And as such, they can fill us with fear. But as we'll see, God in his great mercy has made a remedy. This restored familial relationship is at the core of our faith. And I think in terms of practical outworking, it is not incidental or accidental that part of the church's legacy has been creating a countless number of orphanages and facilitating adoption around the world. When an English theologian, I'll just say his name, J.I. Packer, chose to sum up the gospel in 3 words, he said, adoption through justification. Adoption through justification. The point was that one of the reasons justification is so glorious and worthy of our praising God for his work and accomplishing it is because it is through justification, through being made righteous before God, because of the imputed righteousness of Christ, that we become God's son. Justification clears us of guilt, yes, and it also sets us up as being right with God, and then we can learn how to live in light of adoption. When speaking of John Calvin, one scholar has said that he restored the fatherhood of God, and another that adoption is at the heart of John Calvin's understanding of salvation. As we look at this passage, I'd like for us to specifically look at verse 3. In verse 3, we read that whether one is a Jew following the law of Moses or a Gentile following God's naturally revealed law, neither was meant to be an end in themselves. The law functioned to curb man's sinful appetites and reveal his sinfulness. In these ways, the law pointed beyond itself to one who was to come. In our Reformed tradition, this has historically been called the first and second uses of the law. In this setup, there are three uses. This threefold use teaches that the first use of the law places a curb or check on man in his fallen state. The second use of the law is to reveal and rebuke sin. And we'll look at the third in just a few seconds. Even though he does not use these terms, this idea is something that Paul is teaching on. Before Christ came, the law functioned in this way for both Jews and Gentiles. Prior to the great moment where we could be adopted as God's sons, it held us, was a guardian over us. It enslaved us. How could this be, you might ask? How could the law of Moses do such a thing? Wasn't it the law of Moses that was given by God? Yes, and here Paul is referring to something he works out further in Romans chapter 7, verse 8. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. It is not that the law is wicked, but it was sin working through the commandment that produced sin and death. The law's third use, however, teaches us how to live as adopted sons and daughters. Its purpose is to guide us in obedience. And with what has been said, we can look at this aspect with joy. Obedience to God is not a burden that has been laid upon us, but a new household ethics. It's how we live as God's family. We love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves because that's what our older brother does. It's what our family does. We can rejoice in obedience as we long to see the face of God. And so to wrap up, because Christ underwent what he underwent on the cross, we do not have to face rejection as orphans. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that we might cry out, Abba, Father. Through forgiveness of sins, by grace and faith alone, we are sons and daughters of the Father. Let us live in light of that. Let us rest on the promise and go out in joy. Please pray with me. Father, we give you thanks again for your word. We give you thanks of how it speaks to us, knowing that when Scripture speaks, you speak. That we know truths about who we really are, of what you have really called us to. May this reality of adoption and this facilitating, making way for us to live in light of your gospel fill us with joy and hope. So we give you thanks this time and give you the rest of this morning. In your name, amen. I'd like to introduce Robert Hassler, fellow ministry associate minister, who's going to introduce for us Jennifer Patterson.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be brief because y'all didn't come here to see me or hear me. We're going to get to the speakers. But I do want to do just a few housekeeping things. First, my name is Robert Hassler. I work with Ministry State. As Will said, I lead our public theology project. Robert, what's the public theology project? That's a great question, and I'll speak more about it later, or you can come find me. But it's a new initiative, Ministry State, that we're really excited about. If you haven't already picked up a program, I recommend that you do that. As you see, we're going to have speakers throughout the day, and at the end of all of those speakers and their remarks, we're going to have some time for Q&A. In the back of the program, there's a fancy little section here for notes. As you are thinking about a question that you would like to ask one of the speakers as they are doing their remarks, I'd recommend that you take a pen and that you write your question down in the notes section. That will accomplish two things. First, it will force you to shorten your question, so it's not 5 minutes long, and you can check to see if your question is in the form of a question. So I would recommend that you do that before we approach the Q&A section. Let's see, I think that's everything I was supposed to cover. So let's go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Patterson. Jennifer Patterson is a lecturer in public theology and director of the Institute for Theology and Public Life at RTS DC. She's worked in public policy in DC for more than 25 years. She holds an MA in religion from Reformed Theological Seminary, an MA in statecraft and world politics from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and a BA in French from Wheaton College. She's currently pursuing her doctoral degree in moral theology and ethics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I'm going to ask Jennifer to go ahead and come up. I know that I was talking to her before, and I know this is true at almost every IRD event where you or your husband are involved. This story is told. I can't give you the full details. You can ask Mark about it, but Jennifer and her husband actually got connected through an IRD event. So you're not here just to listen to theology. You could potentially meet your spouse here. So,
Thank you, Robert. Well, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a joy to be here. We're grateful for the ministry of both of these organizations, and we have a special fondness for IRD. And my husband actually serves on the board, so we're grateful for Mark and his team. Robert mentioned the Institute for Theology and Public Life at RTS Washington, and I'm grateful to him for doing that. At RTS Washington, we are preparing pastors for leading churches, and many of them will go to lead congregations here in the Washington, D.C. area. You are hearing from a couple of those pastors this weekend who have been trained with us. And in that ministry, leading congregations in Washington, D.C., it's unique in the country. There are leaders of public policy in the pews at the churches that our graduates of RTS Washington are preaching to and teaching and leading. And there are public policy staff from the Hill, from federal agencies, from think tanks, members of Congress, members of the judiciary, military, intelligence officials. So it's a unique kind of congregation that you have in the Washington, D.C. area, and that's part of the reason we started the Institute for Theology and Public Life. We also saw more and more individuals from those specific careers coming to RTS Washington to think more about the intersection of theology and public life. I was one of those. I'd been working in public policy for something like 15 years and wanted to reflect more deeply on theology as it applies to public life. So I got a Master's of Arts in Religion at RTS Washington, and then have for the last decade been helping build out a program in theology and public life. We offer a certificate, and one of the things that we try to do in the electives that are part of this certificate program is to bring in practitioners who are experts in public policy fields and also very competent in theology to be able to guide us in a conversation between those two disciplines. And that's one thing that we are very convinced of, that we need the specialized insights of theology and we need the specialized insights of public policy practitioners to be in better conversation and exchange in order to deepen our wisdom for public life. So wisdom for public life is where I want to focus my remarks today. And I'll give you an overview of kind of the map that I want to take through this topic, 5 points. First is to just establish a basic paradigm and pattern for biblical wisdom and our acquiring biblical wisdom. Second is to look at Reformed theology as a grammar of creation and to review some of the grammar that'll be familiar to you, just to think about it as a grammar of creation. Then that brings us to a third point and asking a question. Is the grammar of our public policy faithful to the grammar of creation? I won't be able to answer an unequivocal yes to that. So that brings us to the fourth point, which is, how do we get the grammar right in our public life? And that finally leads us to church formation for wisdom in public life. So let's begin with the pattern of wisdom. What we are seeking to do at ITPL, the Institute for Theology and Public Life at RTS Washington, is to apply the basic biblical pattern of wisdom to our life together in the public square. There's a pattern to wisdom in Scripture, and I think we can trace 3 movements in it. So picture the pattern that a conductor of a band or an orchestra would use to direct an orchestra in music that has 3 beats to the measure. Now, some of you will be flashing back to your elementary band days, but this is the 3-beat measure. Downward, outward, upward. Downward, outward, upward. Flashback? I think this is a good paradigm, a good visualization of the way that we acquire wisdom. The downward movement, learning God's word and his wisdom in creation. The outward movement, getting to know the details of the world in its current situation. And upward, taking action to restore and develop creation in line with God's wisdom. So the pursuit of wisdom takes us from God's word to the world's situation to our obedient response. The church forms us in this pattern, and each of our callings invites us to apply it again and again as we get more acquainted with the situations of the world around us in our daily callings. And this same pattern of wisdom is needed in public life. Now, we start, obviously, with a very confused situation. We live in a country whose laws were shaped by centuries of Christian tradition and a pervasively Christian population. But now we live in an increasingly pluralistic society with deep confusion about what it means to be human. If you think about it, some of our most heated debates are challenges to truths that we learn in Genesis 1. Truths that we are created in the image of God, male and female, made for each other in marriage, made to flourish in right relationship with God, with others around us, with creation, and even with ourselves. Well, what can Reformed theology offer in the midst of this confusion? I want to argue that Reformed theology gives us a biblical grammar of creation. It helps us name created reality and to discern right relationships within it. It helps us understand how sin has distorted our current situation, and yet how God's grace is working even now to restore creation in this context. And finally, Reformed theology helps us grow in our discernment of our callings and how to engage wisely in an apologetic way in our current situation. And as you can see, I've traced the same pattern of wisdom in those 3 remarks. So let me drill down a little deeper in each of those axes, in each of those movements. Reformed theology, first, teaches us a rich doctrine of creation as the revelation of God's wisdom. Genesis 1, right away, is telling us that God made humanity in his image. And this has massive implications for public policy. Let me name just a few of them. First of all, imaging underscores the givenness of human nature. And you know that this is called into question in many, many ways today, the givenness of human nature. The fact that we are made in the image of God reinforces the creator-creature distinction. It reminds us of our dependence, our non-ultimacy as creatures. It grounds our identity in a God-given human nature, and it contradicts the radical autonomy that's asserted in so many places. Imaging is also ethical. God's character is the standard of ethics, and we are to reflect it. He discloses that character in his moral law, which is written on the human heart and in Scripture, and is the foundation of our duties to God and to our neighbors. Imaging involves the whole person and the whole of humanity. This is an insight of Herman Bavinck, the Dutch Reformed theologian a century ago. And he speaks in very rich terms about it. All humanity images God. Bavinck says this: the image of God is much too rich for it to be fully realized in a single human being. Only humanity in its entirety is the fully finished image, the most telling and striking likeness of God. How beautiful to reflect on that. Imaging also involves the whole of the person, and this gives significance to all aspects of human nature: the material, the intellectual, the relational, the psychological. And that means we need to be concerned about the welfare of our neighbors in all those dimensions. It endows human beings with dignity regardless of their capacities or stage of development. Imaging is relational because God is relational. Creation is the self-communication of a triune God. He forms and then fills the spheres of the cosmos, the heavens, the seas, the dry lands. And then God makes human beings in his image, and he commissions them to follow his pattern of forming and filling. And that task can only be pursued in community. beginning with the relationship of male and female and extending to the whole of humanity. God created human beings, male and female, in his image, both individually and, Bobbing says, in mutual relationship. God made two out of one so that he could then make the two into one in marriage. Well, God's design for human flourishing is structured around four essential relationships, and I've already alluded to them. These are communion with God, peace with self, harmony with others, and nurture toward the created world. I think this gives us a very nice framework to think about our callings when they pertain to public policy, because this is a framework for true human flourishing in these four dimensions, and I'll be returning to it throughout my comments. True human flourishing is wholeness and harmony in these four relations. A just order is one of right relationships between individuals and institutions. Finally, imaging is expressed in work and in oversight of creation after the pattern of our Creator. And that brings us to the cultural mandate, the Creator's charge to humanity. It's a pretty amazing thing to reflect on, the fact that God entrusts his good creation to human stewardship. And he gives us specific tasks for doing that in Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful, to multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, exercise dominion within creation. Each of those very clear commands is an imperative that implies a range of human activity to be able to fulfill it. The cultural mandate is vast because God's creation is vast and designed to be developed in ways that require differentiated responsibility. God specifically ordained the institutions of family, of government, and church. And other institutions and associations emerge as people use their gifts to draw out the potential of creation and to develop it. So one test of government's success in fulfilling its role is its respect for these other spheres. Government shows deference by maintaining conditions for family, church, commerce, scholarship, and any number of other activities and associations by allowing them to flourish, not mistaking its role as government for theirs. At the same time, government has very particular tasks and the authority to maintain a just public order under law. And we get a picture of that in Romans 13 and elsewhere. Reformed theology also helps us discern our present situation in the wake of the fall. Adam's sin brought about God's judgment on humanity and all creation. But God also responded with grace to restrain sin's effects and to defer the fullness of his judgment until his plan for redemption has been fully realized. That means we live in a time when the opposing realities of grace and sin are at work, and we should take stock of both. So the reality of sin. Sin distorts all of the relations I've mentioned with God, self, others, and the world. And all of the challenges we see in public life are affected by that. Sin rejects God's wisdom in creation, and it champions a rival vision of flourishing, one in which the path to fulfillment is paved by control and autonomy. Sin resists the givenness, the limits of human nature, and it rejects our dependence on one another. In our generation, expressive individualism is the version of this primordial sin. It's at the root of many of our public controversies today. Expressive individualism is a path on which a person is on a quest to discover reality for himself, from within himself, in order to project his self-understanding outside of himself and to demand that everyone else affirm that perceived reality. So the consequences, of course, work their way into all the corners of creation. But God's grace opposes sin by working throughout creation to restore it, renewing and redirecting the elements internal to the structures of creation so that they might once again bring about wholeness and harmony and manifest the goodness of God's design. Reformed theology has distinguished between common grace and special grace. God extends grace that restrains sin and preserves good within his creation to the benefit of all people. And this common grace provides for his work of redemption to proceed through particular grace that works salvation for his own people. Civil government is an instrument of God's common grace and reflects his glory as it restrains sin and nurtures good in society. Reformed theology helps us in this time where grace and sin are at work. Reformed theology helps us to discern the arc of God's work in history. We live in a time when Christ has accomplished all that is necessary for the redemption of his kingdom, and yet that kingdom has not yet been fully realized. Christ's victory over sin and death was the vindication of creation, says Oliver O'Donovan. As a result, Christians have full reason to vindicate God's wisdom in creation as we deliberate in our common life. We should do so with confidence. We should do so with patience. History belongs to God, and it will reach its consummation in his time, not ours. Well, we've looked at the normative framework of God's creation. We've looked at our situation, given the realities of sin and grace. And for the third step of our pattern in wisdom, we need to look at our responsibility to act in light of these. And that brings us to the topic of callings and apologetics. Reformed teaching has held a high regard for our personal callings as a means to pursue our first and highest calling, which is to glorify God and to enjoy fellowship with him. Our callings are ways that we protect, restore, and develop aspects of creation and life together in this current world, in response to the cultural mandate and in response to the realities of sin. I'm making an emphasis on the plural callings here because each of us has multiple callings that shift in some degree throughout the phases of our lives. For all of us, our callings are going to include citizenship. And our representative democracy, our form of government, requires active citizenship. For many in this region, our callings also involve public service, a specific calling vocationally to public policy. As Christians, we should be encouraging those who are called to public life and to public policy in the patience and the perseverance that is so demanded by this very difficult and fraught time in our public life together. We need to encourage patience and perseverance for those who are in public policy. We should honor the efforts of those who dedicate long years to gaining and applying expertise in efforts that are seeking to echo the grammar of creation in public life. And we'll have more to say about that in a minute. We need wisdom for these callings, and pastors need wisdom about how to help form us for these callings. Reformed theology has also approached apologetics with the confidence that any truth in God's cosmos can serve as a point of contact for the heart that is bent away from God and his moral law, in order to be able to recognize that its current course can't attain its hopes. A Christian account of God's wisdom in creation and in redemption offers what rival accounts cannot. Just one example, expressive individualism cannot produce the autonomous, independent individuals that it assumes. That's a point that law professor Carter Snead makes. And he also points out that we're born extremely dependent. It takes about 2 decades of very sacrificial giving on the part of other people to get us to a place where we're relatively independent some of the time. Expressive individualism does not produce the independence that it requires for its system to work. Ecclesiastes 3 says that God has written eternity on the hearts of all, and that includes those with whom I'm debating about public policy. That means ad hominem attacks are out of bounds. It cuts through intimidation. It gives a point of contact. These issues are more often matters of the heart than they are of the head. When it comes to our apologetic outlook on public life, the love of God and neighbor compel us as believers to commend God's wisdom in creation, to seek consensus in our public life reflecting the patterns of wisdom, and to be confident in the work of the Holy Spirit in common grace to bless those efforts through God's ordained institution of civil government. Theology gives us a biblical grammar of creation. It describes the fundamental structures of reality and how they relate. Other fields spell out that grammar and its implications as they develop aspects of creation. So metaphysics, a very abstract field, metalworking, a very concrete field, have their own specialized grammars. But these specialized grammars depend on the grammar of creation to make sense of the world. And to the extent that a specialized grammar neglects or negates created reality and relationships, it will undermine itself and become directed away from God, unable to describe reality in a way that we can depend upon, and contributing more problems than it can solve. Public policy is a specialized grammar. It even has a lexicon. In fact, the very first section of the US Code is called the Dictionary Act, and it defines words like person, marriage, signature, and other very technical terms. Every law and regulation, well beyond that first section of the code, every law and regulation has definitions and meanings for the terms that it uses. And every policy authorizes certain agents and certain actions. It modifies relationships among persons and institutions as it does so. Is the grammar of our public policy faithful to created reality? Well, we have to point to glaring failures over the course of American history, describing enslaved Africans as property, treating unborn human life as just so much disposable tissue, detaching marriage and sex from created reality. On the other hand, we can also point to important ways that our system of government has been anchored in the grammar of creation. There's a general concept that civil officials are accountable to authority beyond themselves, both the written law and to God. There's a recognition of multiple spheres of authority and responsibility in society, like the family, like the church, and limits to government in respect of those institutions' scope of authority. There's a recognition generally of the importance of work, reward for labor, and rest. And these are consistent with a biblical understanding of human nature. Now, if, as I was naming those positive elements, you thought of exceptions, good. That shows that you're thinking of our system of government in all its complexities, all the different complex systems that make up the public policy landscape. And I want you to hold that thought because I'm going to come back to it in a minute. But what should we say in conclusion about the grammar of our current public policy? Does it reflect the grammar of creation? We have to say that it's uneven. And in too many instances, we have to say that the answer is no, it does not reflect that. And then we need to ask what to do about it. That brings us to getting the grammar right. We live in a country with a complex system of government, a federal, state, and local complex of governments. And we have an advanced welfare state, a very complicated tax code, a large-scale military-industrial complex. Given these conditions, reform is a long-term proposition. It is also a serious and honorable calling. And we need individuals who will spend decades mastering and leading to reform that better reflects the grammar of creation within these and other policy areas. We need institutions that will build consensus over the decades about reforms that will better reflect creation. So consider the area of healthcare reform. The Affordable Care Act, which has been popularly known as Obamacare, became law more than a decade ago. And whatever benefits Americans might enjoy as a result of that law, old and new healthcare problems have resulted in its wake. Those include subpar healthcare options for low-income Americans and new mandates that create conscience conflicts for doctors who decline to be involved in gender transition treatments. That law, Obamacare, was almost 1,000 pages long. It's had more than 250 rulemaking activities associated with it, and that was all on top of the rules and regulations that already existed in healthcare before it. As you can grasp, the details are myriad. And if the grammar of healthcare policy is to echo the grammar of creation, it will require the dedication of mastering this sort of detail. The leaven of Christian influence is needed at this level of systemic reform. This is a neglected area. We tend to think in broad principles, but not in terms of concrete implementation and systemic reform. Some of that comes from principled aversion to government programs as they currently exist. But even for those who want to see an entirely different approach to the way our federal government handles or doesn't handle these issues, the work starts within. There's no wishing away the problem. For the long-term change that we seek, there's no way around the hard work of systemic reform. And systemic reform proceeds through an approach intrinsic to the current structures and programs in order to bring about change. Now, to explain what I mean by an intrinsic approach to reform, let me highlight through an example by way of contrast. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember the faith-based partnerships initiative that President George W. Bush launched right after becoming president, his inauguration in 2001. It was an effort to tap successful faith-based ministries who were helping to tackle social problems that the federal government was proving very unsuccessful at tackling. President Bush created a faith-based office at the White House and similar offices in a number of federal agencies like the Department of Education and Labor, USAID, and others. These offices were to further the work of faith-based groups operating in their area of government, whether by reducing regulatory burdens or by leveling the playing field for these groups to be able to participate in federal programs, which they had previously, in many cases, been excluded from that. Well, President Bush got plenty of criticism for this initiative. Some people said he was expanding government. Some people said he was making religious groups depend on government, making them dependent on federal funding. Some said he was violating the separation of church and state. Some said he was just giving out funding to his base. Well, in my view, the project began with a profound insight that got wedged into an ill-fitting implementation plan. The profound insight was this: redemption changes lives. A changed heart could change behavior, President Bush said. He knew that from personal experience. Some of you may recall, at the age of 40, Bush had gotten serious about his Christian faith. And he had, as a result, put an alcohol problem behind him and gotten serious about his responsibilities in life. He saw the power that had worked in his own life at work in faith-based ministries, through which addicts became free from problems that seemed to hold not just their bodies, but also their souls in bondage. These were the kind of problems that typical social programs often seemed unable to touch. Well, President Bush came to Washington wanting to see the success of faith-based interventions spread in their communities and in the federal government's approach to social service efforts. It was a powerful insight and a noble intention, but the structure of the faith-based initiative limited what it could achieve. Faith-based ministries have transformed lives, but the faith-based initiative hasn't transformed government to any great extent. And that's because the faith-based offices operated outside the fabric of pre-existing federal agencies. Existing programs went on about their business while faith-based offices were in their own lane of activity. Now, this was not for lack of effort. There were highly competent, excellent people at the heads of these offices who did the absolute most that they could within the design of the program. But the design of the initiative was extrinsic to the structure of federal programs as a whole. As a result, its principles did little to change the character of government social services or their systemic approach to policy challenges. To accomplish more thoroughgoing reform, what was needed was a diffusion of the original insight throughout the whole structure of agencies like HHS and education and labor, not just one self-contained office. What was needed were program managers throughout each agency who had the eye of Alexis de Tocqueville, who could survey civil society and see what was promising, to recognize how to creatively reform their programs to better coordinate with what was succeeding in faith-based groups and on the ground. Much of the work wouldn't even involve funding. It would involve government taking seriously the role of other institutions and taking seriously its role to allow them to flourish. Well, the point of this anecdote is not the faith-based initiative, and I'm not pronouncing judgment on it or proposing to reboot it. I could have used other examples to illustrate proposals that are extrinsic to the operations of a system as a whole, like health savings accounts in contrast to systemic healthcare reform, or charitable choice in contrast to systemic welfare reform. That's an example of a certain vintage. But these policies have value and do considerable good. We just shouldn't mistake them for systemic reform. Restoring the grammar of public policy to reflect the grammar of creation requires an intrinsic approach. It requires specialization to master the details of the current situation in a public policy system like healthcare or education. That specialization is needed to wisely lead to systemic reform that better reflects created reality in its concepts and in the relationships that it establishes among individuals and institutions. Now, in the several decades that I worked in public policy, whenever I had the chance to speak to college students or young people who were interested in working in policy, I would always appeal to them to become this kind of expert leader, mastering the code in a key policy area, dedicating their career to the reform of a field like welfare. And I'll make that appeal here today for anyone who's in policy or anyone interested in working in policy. This kind of expert leader knows the challenges on the ground and on paper. In other words, this is an expert who knows what systemic education problems look like for the family of a third grader in Southeast DC, anxious about safety, frustrated about academics, and an expert who knows what policies on the books are contributing to those problems year after year, child after child, family after family. Expert leaders diagnose problems, craft specific reforms to current programs and structures, build consensus around those reforms, and stay the course to achieve them. They are invested in solutions and seek better outcomes for all. For Christians working in public policy, this kind of systemic reform is where the leaven works most fully to restore public policy concepts and operations that correspond with created reality. But we will miss the opportunity to apply this pattern of wisdom if we get pulled into the ubiquitous, personality-driven, sports-style coverage of politics. That is punditry, and it gets caught up in picking winners and losers. We are called to stewardship, and stewardship is concerned with intrinsic efforts that align the grammar of public policy with the grammar of creation. It's hard work, and it requires perseverance and patience, and that requires formation in the church. How can pastors and other church leaders help us to cultivate this pattern for public policy, both for us as citizens generally and to those called specifically to the sort of specialization I've just described? Well, I think there are many issues, many aspects of the life of the church that help us to do that, including the preaching and teaching of the church, its ministry life, its prayer habits, its watching for the work of the Spirit in common grace. Let me go through a few examples of that in each of those areas. In terms of preaching and teaching, a part of the church's task in each generation is to recognize and confront false testimonies about created reality. Church's exegetical preaching, teaching, and formation should ground us in the grammar of creation, especially where that is most vehemently denied in our culture today with respect to what it means to be human. Those denials of what it means to be human include support for abortion and assisted suicide, the embrace of fluid concepts of marriage and sexual orientation and gender identity. Preaching and teaching should also help us develop the habit of recognizing how sin distorts relationships among individuals and among institutions, and recognize the hope we have in the power of God's grace to overcome sin. A church's ministry life shapes believers' public theology. Mercy ministries build our habits of looking to the needs of others. The shape of these ministries will express our convictions about what it means to be made in the image of God. Churches have the capacity to address the needs of the whole person, relationally, spiritually, not merely materially. When we get to know our neighbors who face complex problems, we get dissatisfied with simplistic answers that only address material need. And that's all too typical of programs, be they government or private. We need to make sure that our efforts in the church don't fall into that same trap. Churches have extraordinary relational resources because the church is grounded in the restored relationship with God brought about through Jesus Christ. We have extraordinary relational gifts to give, and we need to share those with the world in our mercy ministries. Effective compassion seeks the flourishing of human beings individually and in community, and it aims to restore relationships with God, self, others, and creation. Complex problems require differentiated responsibility, and multiple institutions have a range of capacities for responding to various dimensions of social challenges. That means that the public square is going to be a place of complex interaction between these institutions. Well, not only the outward-facing, but also the inward-facing ministries of the church are significant for our growth in wisdom about public life. The fellowship and hospitality experienced in the local body are foundational. It matters a great deal how the local church cares for its members in all dimensions of their identity as image bearers, through family challenges, financial hardships, cultural hostility, spiritual struggle, sickness, death. We're formed by seeing this holistic care at work in a congregation and by receiving it and giving it ourselves. This care forges deep belonging and makes concrete our identity as the body of Christ. This kind of church culture nurtures the virtues of responsibility and mutual concern that carry over into our lives as citizens. A congregation's habits for welcoming visitors, assimilating new members, approaching differences of background, language, race, socioeconomic status, all of these things teach habits that shape our responses to issues in the public square. And they also form our imaginations for how the church is a part of resolving and contributing to the harmony of our lives together in public. And at the same time, the experience of covenant community in the church ought also to sharpen the contrast with the world in some respects, even in differing expectations about politics. Augustine observed that politics is about ordering our loves to their proper objects and ends. And one of the reasons that politics gets off track is that humans are tempted to place inordinate hopes in it. We ask too much and have too much expectation, and this is part of the apocalyptic tone that we find around us in current politics. Gathering as God's people in the church reminds us that politics is not ultimate. Now, on a slightly different tone about the internal life of the church, let me share an unpopular opinion. I want to praise the Presbyterian committee form and its parliamentary structure of government. I know that's very unpopular, but these are aspects of church life together that positively contribute to sound grammar in public life. Presbyterian government is training ground for our system of civil government, centered on deliberative, representative, legislative bodies, participating in and deferring to committees, presbyteries, General Assembly, shapes us. That includes the often slow and tedious work of committees, but that is exactly the kind of skill that's needed for the systemic reform that I talked about. I grew up in the OPC, and I don't remember much political discourse around me, but I sure remember a lot of committee activities that my parents were involved in. And I think that had shaping effect on me and my interest in being a part of the political life. We shouldn't overlook how these mundane aspects of life in the church are forming us. We should talk about them with esteem and recognize what richness there is in our life together, even in these rather tedious aspects of it. Well, corporate prayer is another aspect of the church's life that is important here. Praying for public officials seems very basic, and so basic that it gets neglected. But Scripture is very unambiguous and thorough in its instruction to us to pray for public officials. We need to not forget that as we pray in corporate worship for our civil authorities, they continually need the wisdom, and the church is perpetually dependent on God's provision for its peaceful existence in society. Especially in an election year, we should pay attention to the ratio in our own lives of political prognosticating to our prayer about our public life. Well, finally, watching for the Spirit's work in the life of the church. Our hopes for the world should be attuned to the Spirit's operations in common grace. We should watch for it and pray for it with anticipation. As believers, we need the help of the Spirit to grow in wisdom. We need to apply it in public life. That we can seek public policy that reflects the grammar of creation is a result of God's blessing. To seek to leaven public life in this way is to desire his favor for the benefit of all and ultimately for his glory. So to wrap up, I'm just going to make summary statements and retrace the ground that I've covered. Reformed theology helps us learn a pattern of wisdom for public life. It does so by providing a biblical grammar of creation. It helps us name created reality and to discern right relationships within it. It also helps us understand how sin has distorted our situation and how grace works to restore creation in this context. Finally, it helps us grow in discernment in our callings and become more capable in our apologetic engagements in our context. If theology brings us a biblical grammar of creation, public policy has a specialized grammar that should reflect it. To the extent that the grammar of public policy neglects or negates created reality in its relationships among created reality, it's going to undermine itself. The grammar of our current public policy departs from the grammar of creation in some crucial ways. And in other ways, policies distort relationships among individuals and institutions in ways that undermine flourishing. To address issues like these, the leaven of Christian worldview will have its greatest effect when it works intrinsically within the structures of the current system. The calling to the kind of long-term public service that this requires is honorable, and it demands patience and perseverance. And churches have a powerful opportunity to help form those virtues in its members for public life. As Christians, we have a duty to encourage our fellow Christians who are called to public life. I know many of you in this room are in these callings, so I want to thank you for your service and encourage you to continue persevering. With that, I'll conclude, and I think we have several minutes for questions. The microphones are in the middle of the room, and since we're live streaming, and I do warn you, we are live streaming for the sake of your questions, but please come to the microphone if you would, if you want to ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm curious as the, what was that? My name? Thank you, Chuck. I'm Robert. Jennifer, I'm curious, the students that are coming through RTSDC, when they're coming in and being introduced to these ideas, what are the operative assumptions that they're coming into the program with? Are they more hostile towards the idea of sort of integrating their faith with public life? Are they over-enthusiastic? Kind of where are they at?
Yeah. You know, if I could kind of aggregate over the course of a decade, I think the greatest confusion is where to start. Like, how do you even dissect what's going on? And that's why I spent, as you can see, what I tried to do here was really to help us get a point of traction between theology and public life. And the thing that has changed dramatically in the time that I've been in Washington, D.C., I came in 1994, so we were just seeing the emergence of cable news at that time. That dramatically changed our political discourse. And then social media dramatically changed it. And it's now, there's so much noise that it's hard to know where to begin to sort it out. So I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to do is let's go back to the basics. Let's go back to the grammar of creation, as I've called it, and work our way into public life. Thank you for that question.
Hey, my name's Josh. So in your experience coming from, obviously, more Reformed, and I think possibly being more attractive to Reformed circles with a lot of these fundamentals, when you look at possibly larger evangelical circles or ones that might not be as familiar with a structured hierarchy in their churches or in other places, and then trying to correlate that with implementing it in governmental circles. Do you feel like you've encountered any pushback with that, or people who cannot conceptualize it the same way as someone who's familiar with Reformed hierarchy?
Yeah, thanks for that. I actually would say that I think what I've been calling the grammar, are actually, they give names to some conceptions that are, we're sort of, they're kind of hanging around in the ether of our conversations about these topics. So I actually found openness to grab onto a name for what that is, and to think through the dimensions of the image of God. There's a general evangelical concept of the image of God. I think we've been able to deepen it. Some Reformed theologians have been able to deepen and really make a nice holistic picture of that. And there's a welcomeness towards that. So I've actually found, that the Reformed theology pays a lot of attention to structures and how the kind of thing I did in my talk, and there's a welcomeness in getting a framework to make some sense of what's bombarding us around us, and IRD has been a place for really sponsoring good conversations among theological traditions that find some conversance and points of contact, even in our own theological vocabularies. Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you again for your talk. I'm Maddie, and my question is about discipleship. I'm receiving great discipleship in my church community and in so many supportive, in real life communities. However, I find that I'm also discipled by the media that I consume. And I know a lot of people are discipled by media that's really interested in just riling up fear-mongering, especially in an election year. Do you have any recommendations or principles or even places to look for how we can engage with an online or digital space from a perspective of Reformed creation view of other humans and the world we live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. One of the analysts that I used to work with, who I would, did this kind of systemic reform that I've talked about and worked at it for decades, didn't have a habit of reading the newspaper. I'm dating myself a little bit because this was, back when we were leaning on, but and online sources and whatever. He wasn't consuming the daily media in the way that others around him were. And it was because he had been around long enough to know that story's going to evaporate by next week, certainly by the end of the year. And I want to keep my eye on the ball of what my calling is and what's important to me. So the first thing, I just put that out there as, an example of that I've come across. And he wasn't making, so it was before social media was all consuming to us, so he wasn't making a comment on habits that regard. So if we're thinking about, how do we habituate ourselves well to take advantage of what is offered in the various forms of media and yet not let it consume us? The first thing is what you're doing, being self-reflective, recognizing that it has an effect on you. And we're all different this way, Is it anxiety-producing to look at Twitter? Is it anxiety-producing to look at the online news before you do your devotionals? Don't do it then. And if you know that it habituates things in you that are not the fruit of the Spirit, that you got to wrestle with. How can you pray for change about that? Modify the level, silence some channels. We've got to be wise consumers based on who we are, what our need for information is, and really test our need for information, right? Do we really need another look at Facebook? Do we need to follow this thread to the very end of every last comment? And be wise. This isn't normative, what I'm about to say, but I'm in the midst of writing a dissertation, and I'm, for all intents and purposes, not on social media at all. And for me, I was not able to do those short fuse things and the long-term reflection that is needed for the kind of work I'm doing right now. So there may be seasons when we need to just really turn it down. And, you know, that we're early in these days of social media, relatively early. We need to be wise consumers while we're waiting for the long-term effects of these things. So great question, really great question.
So my name is Terrence Little.
Hello,
and
Terrence.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Jennifer. No, just a little bit. But I'm intrigued in the things that you've said today and thinking about the grammar of creation. I'd love to hear you offer any critique or thoughts on that and the Harlem Children's, the Harlem's Children's Zone that occurred in Harlem through Jeffrey Canada, and just thinking about what he did, what happened there, things that we could learn from that in seeking to do the intrinsic work.
For the sake of can you enumerate some of the things that you're thinking of when you think of that, the Children's Zone?
I think about him figuring out how can we best help kids, and he ultimately thought we have to help them in utero, but then he thought, we've got to go beyond utero, we've got to go to the parents themselves. Mm-hmm. And the initiatives that he started, something called Baby College, but all these different things to literally try to reconstruct the family. But he never said he did it based on the Christian world and life view. Mm-hmm. So I'm intrigued to hear you interact there a little.
I interacted with that about probably 15 to 20 years ago, and I'm forgetting the details now of the funding structures and how much was private and public and so on. So I'm going to be a bit vague in my answers because of that. But I loved the imagination of all that. The refusal to accept the status quo and the energy that was creating a, maybe greenhouse is the way to think about it, in an area where he was disgusted with the blight of systems in that area. And when you start tackling education, you soon realize that you've got to deal with the family. And when you start dealing with the family, then you realize, well, there are economic problems, and you soon get all of these that I mentioned today of education and healthcare and economics are interrelated. So I did about a one-dimensional presentation. We need like a three-dimensional way of thinking about this and becoming more expert in how we tackle these clusters of social problems. I do think that there is a common grace. You can see a pattern of common grace recognition among many entrepreneurs in this space, recognizing the need of the family, the importance of moms and dads to kids. And, we can think of it in other debates as well, that, there has been J.K. Rowling in the transgender debate and so on. I think that there is a need to work in coalition broadly with people who recognize the reality of creation, and bring along to complement and enrich the projects that are going on, and under a Christian understanding of how can we, marriage in particular is an area where the church has a deep set of resources that the world needs. And we need to do more on marriage education, marriage mentoring, and so on. There is extraordinary need for that right now. Brad Wilcox's new book, I hope you all are acquainted with. But we have been very uncreative in the church, I would say, about how we might bring resources to bear on the collapse of marriage in our country. And the cascade of social challenges that come from that are so great that it's a place where we've got to be thinking more as Christians. Thank you for that. Time to wrap?
We need to wrap up. If you have another question, save it. We're going to have a panel discussion later today. You can bring it up there. Please join me in thanking Jennifer for your time. Thank you. If everyone could kind of start moving back to their seat. The people up in the upstairs cafe, if you can hear me, I need like a PA system to go through the entire church. Maybe that's what I'll do. We're going to get started for our second session. If everyone could kind of please start coming in and filtering in and coming back to your seats. Reverend Esquire Porter, could you please see if there's anybody in the hallway if they want to kind of start moving down here? Do the people upstairs know we're kind of getting started again? Well, we're going to get started for our afternoon, or our second morning session. We're going to hear from Dr. James Wood, and I'm going to do a quick introduction. James Wood is an assistant professor of ministry at Redeemer University in Ontario. Previously, he worked as an associate editor at First Things Magazine. He was a PCA pastor in Austin, Texas, and a campus evangelist and team leader with Cru Ministries at the University of Texas at Austin, where he went to school, got his undergrad. It really speaks to the ways that the gospel breaks down barriers. Will Stockdale is an Aggie. James is a Longhorn. What the Lord won't do, bringing people together. He has his MDiv from Redeemer Seminary in Dallas, Redeemer Seminary, the OG RTS Seminary in Dallas, and a THM from Princeton Seminary, and his PhD from the University of Toronto. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. James Wood?
Well, it's an honor to be with you. My talk will be a bit different than Jennifer's excellent presentation. I'm no policy advisor or expert in practical politics. I am a lowly theologian. And so my goals this morning are modest. I want to help us retrieve key principles of classical Presbyterian political thought. I want to help give us back our past so that we can properly respond to our present and continue to build towards our future. And as we do so, that we're more properly informed and fully funded as Reformed Presbyterians. We are in a time in which the topic of public religion is being revisited. Most are now intuitively aware that there's something amiss with the late modern conceit that religion must be cordoned off from the private sphere. In fact, over the past half century, contestation on this theme has been growing. In an important work in the early 1990s, Public Religions in the Modern World, Jose Casanova documented the emergent movements of religious deprivatization in the last quarter of the 20th century. And this was exhibited not just among Christians, but many religious groups had increasingly come to resist the small space afforded them by modern secularism. There are many reasons for this in America. We could begin our explanation from various points, but would especially have to include things like the civil rights movement, liberation theology, the emergence of the religious right in response to the sexual revolution and Roe v. Wade, and also the revived civil religion during the Cold War that pit Christian America against atheist communism. All of these can be subsumed under the label, the broad label of the American culture wars, which are also battles about public religion. But then the 1990s you could characterize as a relative social and political détente. A healthy economy and geopolitical dominance papered over many of the cultural battles. Many of the debates seemed to be exhausted. History appeared to have ended with the hegemony of liberal democracy and neoliberal capitalism. However, 9/11 sent shockwaves into the system and reignited debates about public religion. Islam would not easily submit to secularization, should Christianity. Had late modern secularism overstepped? Had history actually ended? And we are all well aware how things have escalated since the mid-2010s. Catholic integralism had its moment in the spotlight, and for the past 18 months, Christian nationalism has been the topic du jour. But I think we can also see wokeness, which went into fever pitch during the pandemic, as a form of public religion. There is a religious energy behind wokeness, and it is stamped by a simulacra of religious doctrines, ethical imperatives, and ritual practices. Wokeness, as I and many others have argued, is a form of heretical civil religion vying to fill a vacuum left by the evacuation of mainline Protestantism. But in this sense, it is an apocalyptic gift, because it reveals what is fundamental and inescapable, reminds us that politics will always be shaped by a religious vision. Religion will not be privatized, and society cannot live without religion. Many are recognizing today. But while wokeness bears witness to this fundamental structural reality, it fills it with the wrong content. But there are also issues with the accounts of the likes of Casanova, who I mentioned earlier, sociologists of religion, who discuss the phenomena of public religion, because they try to envision how religion can fit within the contemporary world, and thus launch from and are limited by the categories of late modern liberal democracy. And I don't want to primarily speak for or against liberal democracy, but I do want to ask if there are resources more native to our Reformed and Presbyterian tradition that can help us think well about public religion. That is what I would like to explore in our brief time together. And you can follow along the outline that I've provided for you just to pay attention to where we're going and what we're talking about. From here, I would like to outline broad contours of classical Reformed and Presbyterian thought on politics, particularly on the relationship between church and state. These outlines represent a consensus among key Reformed thinkers and original confessional documents. I'll be working from 7 key Reformed and Presbyterian texts. I'll list them here so you know what's in the background. The first is Politica by Johannes Althusius, which is probably the most important work of early Reformed political theory. The second and third are 2 important texts expounding Presbyterian political theory around the time of the Westminster Assembly, which also help us understand the views present in Presbyterianism's confessional documents. Those 2 texts are George Gillespie's Aaron's Rod Blossoming and the volume entitled Jus Divinum Regimenis Ecclesiasticae. Both of these texts are broadly perceived as representing consensus views of the majority of the Assembly divines, especially on church-state matters. Fourth and fifth, I'll be looking at relevant sections in 2 major systematic works in the 17th century, the Leiden Synopsis of Pure Theology and Francis Turretin's Institutes of Eclectic Theology. The former was and is referred to by almost every major work of Reformed theology ever since it was written, and represents an early broad consensus among the Reformed during this period. Turretin has been referred to as the most precise theologian in the Calvinistic tradition. He wrote the premier systematic series of Reformed scholasticism, and his sections on the church and the civil magistrate in this work are remarkable for their comprehensive scope and depth of analysis. Sixth and seventh are works by 2 leading 19th century Presbyterian theologians, Scottish Presbyterian James Bannerman and American Presbyterian Charles Hodge. Bannerman's Church of Christ has been described by Joel Beakey as, quote, the most extensive, standard, solid, Reformed treatment of the doctrine of the church that has ever been written, end quote. And it includes an exhaustive treatment of the relationship between the church and the state. Hodge's systematic series eventually replaced Turretin's for Reformed dogmatics in elite Reformed institutions in America. And he is particularly interesting because he's an exemplar of what came to be known as the position of the spirituality of the church, mentioned in the opening address. We'll discuss that position and Hodge's relation to it just briefly at the end. But hopefully tracing out these key themes from these important texts will help us better interpret the American revisions to the Westminster Confession. And when we come to that point in our discussion, I'll briefly engage a prominent critic of Abraham Kuyper over his proposed changes to a sister confession, the Belgic. P.J. Hoedemaker's arguments on that front, I think, help us better interpret similar revisions to our Reformed confession. But let us begin by outlining broad contours of the classical Reformed and Presbyterian political theory. Reformed political theory begins fundamentally not just with the comprehensive lordship of Christ, but also his twofold kingdom, over which he administers his authority in different ways. There are 2 bodies, civil and ecclesiastical, with 2 different jurisdictions. And we'll outline these differences according to the Aristotelian causes in a moment. But first, we need to draw attention to the fact that classical Reformed teaching grounds this distinction between these 2 bodies and authorities in Old Testament Israel itself. For instance, consider the chapter in Gillespie's Aaron's Rod Blossoming that's titled, That the Jewish Church was formerly distinct from the Jewish state or commonwealth. The arguments presented therein are cited and echoed in the likes of Turretin, Bannerman, and Hoedemaker. Hear Turretin on this front, quote, the church of the Old Testament had its own peculiar polity and form of sacred government, in the exercise of which the ministry had a power distinct from the political, according to the institution of God himself, end quote. Thus, a citizen was not necessarily a member with full privileges in the ecclesiastical community. And certain members of the religious community, like proselytes, were not necessarily full citizens. They could take part in the ecclesiastical community even though they did not enjoy the full benefits of the Commonwealth. So thus the church and state were distinguished according to these authors. In another chapter, Gillespie even makes this case, he builds on this case by appealing to the distinction to what he perceives as two Sanhedrins in Israel. Gillespie and Bannerman appeal to texts like Deuteronomy 17, 2 Chronicles 19, and Jeremiah 26 as evidence for two groups of elders, or two courts, or two groups of office bearers in the life of Old Testament Israel. All of these authors that I've been mentioning thus far observe in the Old Testament two different communities, or social bodies, with unique authorities. The ones who conflated these communities and denied this fundamental distinction in Israel were the Anabaptists and the Erastians, both of whom have always been opposed by classical Presbyterian political thought. Bannerman mentions this confusion about Israel and says it's been effectively refuted by Gillespie, who quote, as were every other favorite Erastian argument, end quote. Well, what is the Erastian position that has always been so virulently opposed by Presbyterians? Well, Erastianism is inspired by the writings of 16th century Swiss theologian Thomas Erastus, who argued that the magistrate is responsible for church discipline. Later, Erastians would expand on this, making the case that the magistrate has authority in spiritual and ecclesiastical matters. This led them, according to Gillespie, to, quote, oppose a church government distinct from the civil, end quote. Several Westminster divines embraced this position. However, the assembly as a whole did not embrace Erastianism, but instead clearly distinguished between civil and ecclesiastical powers. This distinction, according to Presbyterian political theory, is de jure divino, from divine law, and applies at all times. The church is a separate body, operating according to a spiritual politics, and we'll discuss that briefly in a moment. But again, this distinction applies for all time. Thus, Presbyterian politics is opposed to the political theory of both Erastians and Papalists, just using classical Presbyterian language here. We do not, a la Catholic integralists, envision church authorities treating the state as the secular arm of the church. Presbyterians are also against the Erastian usurping of ecclesiastical duties. Presbyterian political theory resists both ecclesiastical domination of the state and Erastian encroachment of the state into ecclesiastical matters. The two must remain distinct and cannot exchange duties. God is sovereign over both bodies, but they remain distinct channels with different instruments. At this point, I want to briefly discuss the term spiritual power. This term draws attention to the fact that the church is a unique body in the world. Coercive, corporal, or pecuniary instruments are off limits to it. Its means are spiritual. And the magistrate cannot perform church discipline. Church discipline is a type of juridical power that is appropriate to the spiritual power and denied to the civil. This is one of the key problems with the Erastian theory. It opposes the church as a divine institution by absorbing it into the civil and taking the church's powers away from it. As Turretin says, Romanists err in excess with regard to church power, whereas Erastians err in defect by saying that no power is given to the church, or that all that is given to it through the magistrate. No, the Orthodox Presbyterian view is that the ecclesiastical power is distinct from the civil. Well, how are they distinct? That brings us to the Aristotelian causes, which I expand on just a bit. They differ in their efficient cause, or origin. The civil power has its origins in God the Creator, where the church has its origins in Christ the Redeemer. Or you could say the civil power has its origins in the Son as God and thus firstborn of creation, through whom and for whom all things were created, including thrones, dominions, authorities, and civil rulers. Versus the church's origins in the Son as man, and thus mediator and head of the church. This is important for our understanding of the state, because it means that God is sovereign regardless of whether the civil body is Christian in any way. And this also allows Christians to recognize legitimate authorities, even when the government is under pagans. The civil and ecclesiastical powers also differ in their subjects, or human agents. First, with regard to the officers, they can be, political authority can be in the hand of heathens. But this is not true for ecclesiastical authority, or it shouldn't be. And with regard to their members, the conditions for membership are different. The church has no direct authority over those outside her communion. They also differ in their objects. The state is concerned with all things directly related to temporal well-being, things like protection of life and property, preservation of civil order, the punishment of evildoers, the promotion of virtue and public morals, etc. The church is directly concerned with its covenant members and sacred things. In a moment, we'll discuss how the civil power also has some indirect concern about these things. But to anticipate this briefly, the state directly advances the secular interests of the polity and only indirectly promotes its spiritual well-being, whereas the church directly furthers the spiritual interests of its members and is only indirectly concerned with contributing to temporal or secular well-being. I'll explain that more in a minute. These two powers differ in their formal causes as well. This can be summarized with the difference between the two terms magisterial versus ministerial authority. Political authority is magisterial, and thus legislative and punitive. The spiritual power is ministerial, and thus primarily declarative. Magistrates have control over bodies and other external goods. Pastors have no right to compulsory power or infliction of temporal punishments. This distinction leads us to the next Aristotelian cause. These two powers differ in their material causes, or means. There are two swords. The temporal sword is legislative, punitive, and can coerce. The spiritual sword involves no coercion or civil punishments, but consists in preaching the word, administering the sacraments, and executing church discipline, of which excommunication is the final recourse. And lastly, they differ in their final causes, or ends. The civil power is ordered ultimately to the glory of God and proximately to civil peace, justice, and order, and thus it is concerned with external observance of public morals. Ecclesial power is directed ultimately to the glory of Christ and proximately to the spiritual good and edification of the church. Again, these two powers cannot exchange duties. As Bannerman says, quote, "It is impossible for the state to do the work of the church, nor is this its primary object. It is equally impossible for the church to do the work of the state. The line drawn by the finger of God between things spiritual and things civil must ever limit the power of the church on the one side and that of the state on the other. The landmarks between were not set up and adjusted by contract, but of old had their foundations laid deep in the nature of things," end quote. Bannerman goes on to say, quote, "Between the extremes which make the state to be the slave of the church and the other extreme which makes the church to be the slave of the state, there is no position that is safe or consistent with sound principle, except that which asserts their mutual and equal independence," end quote. And Presbyterian political theory is clear that these powers remain distinct, even where the state is Christian. However, as I'll go on to explain, while these powers are distinct, according to classical Presbyterian political theory, they are not entirely unrelated to one another. This will bring Presbyterian political theology into some conflict with Anabaptist and Neo-Anabaptist thought. Yes, Presbyterians reject absolutism from either side, either Erastian civil absolutism or integralist ecclesial absolutism. However, classical Presbyterian political theory does not, as a result, endorse public secularism or just mere pluralism in a sense. Rather, the civil and ecclesiastical powers have duties toward each other. I want to start by briefly mentioning the church's duties towards the civil power. Many have described Reformed theology as helping restore the dignity of temporal power. This is partly because the Reformed tradition denies the church direct authority over the civil power and does not, a la Catholic integralism, perceive the state as the secular arm of the church, as I've mentioned. Romanists attempt to seize the sword from the state and to refuse to let the state draw its sword without the permission of the Pope. I know not every Catholic thinks. I studied Honor de Lubac. He doesn't think that. But certain aspects of classical Roman political theory does. This denies the dignity conferred upon political rulers in Scripture. And this denial is exacerbated with Romanist pretensions of the papal right to depose unbelieving magistrates. In contrast, Presbyterian political theology, in that theology, the church honors the authority of the civil power. The church is not over the civil power, but it is also not immune from it. This differs from the Romanists, who imagine that certain clergy are exempt from civil sanctions. Rather, citing examples in the Old Testament in which priests were subject to political magistrates in civil and criminal affairs, Reformed theology honors the legitimate authority of civil rulers. But part of this honoring includes exhorting magistrates to do their duties, and if they fail, to rebuke them and pronounce the judgment of God against them. But now let us come to the duties of the civil power to God, the church, and true religion, the real spicy stuff. As Althusius explains, government leads what is governed toward its end. For humans and human society, this involves concerns of both body and soul. And Bannerman argues that the magistrate's duties toward religion are not derived from the personal character of a particular magistrate, but from the nature of his office. He must, in some way, regardless of whether he is a Christian, concern himself with higher realities. This leads us to a discussion of the magistrate's duties towards the two tables of the Decalogue. Classical Reformed teaching on the political is grounded in discussion of the Decalogue, which is an encapsulation of the natural law of what is morally demanded at all times for all peoples. I don't have time to expand on this much, but many others have already done great work on this in recent years, helping retrieve the natural law for Reformed theology. But in classical Reformed political theology, the magistrate has duties toward both tables, not just the second. Certainly, his duties toward the second table are more direct. But overall, his job is to ensure that the civil laws correspond to natural law. And this natural law also tells us that we were made to worship and honor God. Thus, the magistrate has a concern for proper worship, i.e., a concern for the first table. But his role here is less direct. As Gillespie argues, the magistrate's scope of care is bigger than his scope of direct operation. We'll have to include other key concepts to help explain this. But the Jus Divinum, in its exposition of the teaching of the Westminster Assembly, says that the magistrate does have some role to punish first table offenses. And Turretin says that magistrates ought to be guardians of both tables. And Althusius argues that magistrates must strengthen true religion in its practice. They reward virtue and punish offenses against either table. Okay, so two key concepts in classical Reformed political theory help us round this out and understand what the teaching is here. And those two concepts are nursing fathers and circus sacra. The concept of the magistrate as a nursing father comes from Isaiah 49, verse 23, and I'll briefly explain what it means in Reformed political theory. But one thing to note from the outset is that this image was largely developed to supplant another biblical theme that had come to dominate medieval Catholic political theory, and it was used to justify Catholic persecution of Protestants. That theme is from the parable of the wedding banquet in Luke 14, from which Augustine had taken the biblical language of compel them to come in to justify the church's use of state force to coerce heretics into the Catholic Church. And I love me some Augustine, but this is wrong. This theme became dominant in successive centuries, justifying religious coercion. The Reformed looked for other resources and found in Isaiah a prophecy about magistrates defending and promoting the true religion that was taught by the churches. John Calvin, if you did not know, was key in developing this theme in his popular 1551 commentary on Isaiah. And this idea became exceedingly popular among Presbyterians, Anglicans, and even Congregationalists. According to Calvin, magistrates who defend the true Reformed religion obtain, quote, this highest pinnacle of rank, which surpasses dominion and principality of every sort, to be nursing fathers and guardians of the church, end quote. To suppress public teachings that they were intended to suppress public teachings that corrupt piety and undermine the public honoring of God. The nursing father tradition was developed to explain that the magistrate does not, though, have direct authority over religious matters, but provides external protection and support. The magistrate must not coerce and compel with regard to religion, but does collaborate with spiritual authorities to promote true religion. The magistrate has a duty to care about these matters, argues Turretin, but is not authorized to directly advance these goods. Rather, the magistrate must attend to them indirectly. And this leads to the other key Reformed political principle, circa sacra. The magistrate has concern for religious matters, but advances them indirectly. The civil power has external care of religion as a nurse father. Appeal in the tradition is often made to figures like Moses, Joshua, Kings Hezekiah, Josiah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, etc., who assisted the reformation of religion in their days without displacing the proper ministry of ecclesiastical authorities. The magistrate thus exercises authority about ecclesiastical objects, but politically, not ecclesiastically. Circa sacra, not in sacris. Turton says that this can be performed without abrogating the power which belongs to church authorities. Quote, because although the two authorities are concerned with the same object materially, still it is not the same formally, end quote. These two powers are concerned with these matters in a different way. Bannerman says that, quote, there is much which the civil magistrate may do circa sacra without involving him in the charge of interfering in sacris, much that he may do when in friendly alliance with the ecclesiastical society to promote its spiritual objects, while he is in no way departing from his own sphere as minister of the state, or assuming the character of powers that belong to the church, end quote. To explain what can and cannot be done, Turton first argues that the Reformed position stands between the views of Erastians and Anabaptists. Regarding the right of the magistrate about sacred things and care of religion, Turton says that the Erastians sin in excess and the Anabaptists sin in defect. The former claim too much about ecclesiastical power for the magistrate. The latter remove the magistrate from all care about ecclesiastical things. The Reformed mean, he says, is summarized this way. The pious and believing magistrate cannot and ought not to be excluded from all care of religion and sacred things, which has been enjoined upon him by God. Rather, this right should be circumscribed within certain limits, that the duties of the ecclesiastical order may be not confounded, but the due parts be left to each, end quote. Turton then lists off things that are off limits for the magistrate. Civil authorities cannot make new articles of faith or institute or enjoin new worship. It does not belong to them to preach the word or administer sacraments. They cannot exercise ecclesiastical discipline. They cannot prescribe to ministers the form of their preaching or administration of the sacraments, etc. However, Turton goes on to explain other duties that the magistrate can perform circa sacra without exercising power in sacris. The magistrate ought to establish religion in this polity, to conserve it when established, or to restore and reform it when it's declining, to protect the church and restrain heretics and disturbers of the ecclesiastical peace, to promote the glory of God, to defend and propagate true religion and hinder the confusion of religions, to provide for the ministry of word and sacraments where it does not exist, to cherish and defend it where it does exist, to open and encourage schools as seedbeds of state and church in which the youth are instructed, etc. One important task that the magistrate performs circa sacra is calling an ecclesiastical council in extraordinary circumstances. Classical Presbyterian expositors often refer to instances in the Old Testament in which magistrates initiated councils, as well as examples of Christian emperors and kings who followed their lead. For instance, Constantine with Nicaea, Theodosius the elder with Constantinople, Theodosius the younger and Valentinian with Ephesus, and Marcion with Chalcedon. The Leiden Synopsis and the Justivinem are very good on this topic. If a great controversy is riling the church, or if worship, doctrine, and discipline have fallen into disarray, then the magistrate has the authority to insist on a council. And afterwards, he has the right and duty to back the ecclesiastical decisions in ways appropriate to his political power. I'd like to conclude this overview section with a brief discussion about the good of such forms of collaboration and even maybe the idea of something like establishment. And first, I'd like to be very, very clear here. The primary point in our analysis thus far has been less about the needs on the side of the church and Christianity in general for public support. Rather, the focus has been on the duty of the civil magistrates, of the civil authorities and public institutions to recognize God and true religion. But I do think that Bannerman is on to something when he argues that strong separation between church and state doesn't actually secure the spiritual independence of the church. For history has shown that the state has a track record of progressively turning against the church when it is not for the church. There is no neutrality, argues Bannerman. The state will inevitably relate to religion in some way. Quote, the state must have to do with religion, and if not in the way of friendly cooperation and consent, then of hostility and opposition, end quote. Bannerman goes on to say that since church and state do inevitably relate in these ways, the conclusion must be that, quote, since they are both ordinances of God, and as such not intended to injure or destroy each other, they must have been designed to cooperate, end quote. And Bannerman does not believe that such cooperation threatens the spiritual independence of the church. Thus, there is the possibility for cooperation, which can, in some ways, benefit the church. However, the main concern is what is needed for the state in order for it to fulfill its duties and secure its proper goods. Althusius argues that turning away from either table of the Decalogue is devastating for the Commonwealth. This leads him to imagine forms of establishment for the sake of civil society. Bannerman also makes a case for the connection between the civil and ecclesiastical bodies, which is fundamentally predicated upon their ineradicable distinction. But Bannerman argues they have a duty to connect. And the line synopsis goes so far as to say as, quote, the greatest possible harmony should be fostered, end quote. Magistracy and ministry, appointed by God for the good of men, are mutually aiding and auxiliary each to other. Thus, though they remain different powers, they can coordinate in ways that are mutually beneficial. And I'll get to why this is in a moment, but let us just make a few distinctions here. First, the recognition of the church by the state does not mean the creation of the church by the state. Rather, explains Bannerman, quote, the magistrate's recognition of the church proceeds upon the acknowledgement that the church existed by a divine authority and institution before, end quote. Thus, the power of the church is not derived from the commission of the state. Bannerman goes on, quote, in every case in which the state knows its duty, it will seek to enter into alliance with the church and lend to its claims of power a civil recognition and warrant. But the recognition of the civil magistrate does not imply that the origin of church power is from the state, but rather the very reverse. It amounts, in fact, to an acknowledgement that the source from which it emanates is divine, end quote. According to classical Presbyterian political theory, the state must, for its own good, recognize the divine body in its midst. And a second distinction, the term establishment can be used in multiple ways. Either it can refer to recognizing a church and professing its religion publicly, or combining that with material support, usually in the forms of benefits from taxes. The latter, though not out of bounds in the Reformed tradition, is not required and in some circumstances is imprudent. Bannerman, expounding on the Westminster Confession, says, quote, we have the general principle of the duty of the nation and magistrate to recognize religion and the church. And why? Because it is, I believe, at all times and in all circumstances incumbent upon him to do so. But we do not have the special application of the principle in reference to pecuniary support, end quote. This will be relevant to the revisions of Westminster in the United States conversation. The third distinction, establishment does not necessarily mean abandonment of toleration. Public religion, especially Presbyterian style, can go together with toleration, though, of course, at various points, practice has fallen far short. But has it been tried? Okay. We'll get it right. Just giving you the theory, guys, all right? As mentioned above, Reformed political theory explicitly rejects any notion of coercing faith. And the likes of Turretin see in the Romanists, especially in the Spanish Inquisition, the attempt to compel faith. Turretin even explicitly rejects the standard invocation of Augustine's interpretation of Luke 14. The Reformed reject the idea that this biblical text underwrites religious compulsion through physical means. No man can lord over conscience. Faith must be voluntary. Hear Turretin, quote, although the magistrate ought to be anxious about the salvation of his subjects and to omit none of those things which are in his power to procure it, does not follow that this ought to be done by violent and unjust means repugnant to divine and natural law, to the example of Christ and to the spirit of Christianity, which breathes both charity and gentleness. Teachers and not torturers are to be employed here. More is gained by admonishing than by threatening, and by teaching than by killing, end quote. Toleration is a value for Reformed political theory. Certain religious errors do have rights with reference to civil authorities, though they never have rights with reference to God. This places limits on toleration. Toleration is for the sake of conscience, for the sake of serving God rather than man. Thus, it is not absolute. And absolute toleration is an impossibility in any society. Quote, the theory of full toleration on the principle of absolute and even-handed indifference on the part of the state alike to truth and falsehood, explains Bannerman, is a mere theory and nothing more. It is impossible to carry it out fully and fairly into practice, end quote. Certain things will always be ruled out of bounds for society. No man can have a right, regardless of conscience claims, to do that which is morally wrong and serves as a threat to civil society. Now, it is very difficult to determine that line. But I'm sorry, that's the burden of magistracy. Don't get in the game if you're not ready for it. This brings us to the religion that undergirds the political body and public morals. Every society will have a public religion. This is inevitable, just like every church will have a creed. The most dangerous ones are those that remain invisible and implicit. Because when the commitments are walled off from contestation, people do not know how to conduct themselves, and things can change at the arbitrary whims of those in power. We should make things more explicit, including the religion around which our polity is ordered and which undergirds our public morality. This does not mean that we should use civil punishments to lead people to salvation or political means to compel faith. Again, Reformed public theology is against coercing faith, but total toleration is a myth. The limits are moral wrong defined by God's law and civil welfare. But civil welfare also concerns matters about the first table, and thus we come to the thorny issue in the tradition of blasphemy and heresy. And I just want to explain how this was what this meant in classical Presbyterian thought. Magistrates have a duty here. There are some forms of blasphemy and heresy, some forms publicly expressed, that undermine respect for the religion undergirding the civil order. We need to make some distinctions here. Some heretics tear at the foundation of the faith, whereas others do not overthrow that foundation. The first should be treated, according to the theory, with civil instruments, whereas the second should be addressed by ecclesiastical authorities, whose final recourse is once again excommunication. And the primary issue regarding the magistrate's concern with the heresy and blasphemy is public promulgation, not mere private belief. So here's another distinction. Some merely err and remain open to correction, or at least are willing to keep their views to themselves. Others are obstinate and seek to win many to their side. If their views are dangerous to society but kept private, the magistrate tolerates. But if they are virulent in their promulgation, the magistrate has a duty to step in. As the synopsis says, quote, "At times the civil ruler can coerce those who are revilers of the highest degree, who irreverently deny God, overturn common religion with shocking reviling, and disturb the peace and harmony of the republic," end quote. But again, always severe caution is prescribed in the tradition. But all of this prepares us to revisit the revisions to the Westminster Confession. How should we interpret these? Let us first comment on the U.S. situation. As James Hudson explains in Church and State in America, the Reformed Christians brought the nursing fathers' understanding of the relationship between church and state with them to America. This was the governing metaphor for church-state relations in the early republic. Furthermore, most of the debates in the post-revolutionary period about establishment were focused on the issue of taxation for ministry funds, explains Hudson. However, there was broad agreement by almost all Protestant groups on other legitimate supports for the nation's churches. For instance, protecting the Sabbath, promoting religion in public schools, promulgating legislation inspired by the moral law and the Bible, test oaths for public office, and even legislation against blasphemy. But eventually, the American Presbyterians did change the Westminster Confession on civil and ecclesiastical power. What did they change? Well, this mostly had to do with Chapter 23, Paragraph 3 on the civil magistrate. In his masterful guide to the Westminster Confession, Chad Van Dixhoorn explains that the American Presbyterians were bothered by the language about the magistrate's duty to defend and promote religion, suppress blasphemies and heresies, and reform corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline. That was in the old school Westminster Confession, if you didn't know. However, I think people reading such comments might misunderstand classic Reformed teaching if they don't have the concepts we've discussed thus far. Always in Reformed teaching, these matters were not the direct purview of the state, but under their concern as nursing fathers, circa sacra. Even Bannerman comments on the original Westminster Confession about this. He says the magistrates were to suppress heresy by calling councils. There you have the former being the goal, the latter being the means. And thus, this is an indirect oversight of these matters. Yes, magistrates could be present at the councils, but could not exert Erastian jurisdiction over them. And even on the calling of councils, I'm not entirely convinced by Van Dixhoorn's interpretation here, and I say this very carefully. I mean, he's an expert, But he says the original drafters at the assembly had clouded judgment because they were convened themselves by Parliament. But in my opinion, this gives them too little credit and also fails to account for the long tradition of conceiving of such circumstances. And this framing also fails to sufficiently, I think, account for the radical opposition to Erastianism that has always informed Presbyterian political theory. Furthermore, Van Dixhoorn argues that American Presbyterians viewed establishing a national church as a confusion of the two governments. I can't speak to that historical account of the American Presbyterians, as this history is not an area of expertise for me. But I can say two things about this idea. First, if the civil authorities in establishment arrangements don't directly interfere in church affairs, how does establishment inherently entail a conflation of powers? As discussed earlier, Presbyterians were adamant, even in conceiving of establishments, about maintaining the distinction between the two governments, and were always on high alert from absorption from either side. Second, I think the language of national establishment just confuses the matter, since there was never a national established church in America, though there were establishments at the state level. This is part of the American experiment, native to our national story. One final area where Van Dixhoorn's explanations leave me a bit perplexed is his discussion of the revisions of Chapter 31 on synods and councils. The original version of the confession included a paragraph about the right of magistrates to call an ecclesiastical synod or council. This was taken out, as Van Dixhoorn notes. Again, he attributes the original framing to the sociology of the assembly divines and their context. He says that Presbyterians increasingly moved from this view toward one which deemed, quote, a magistrate's involvement in calling a synod would be the exception and not the rule, end quote. But I'm not convinced that this was not the common understanding prior to the revisions. The original version said magistrates may call a synod and appealed to instances that were obviously uncommon, which would seem to suggest that the Westminster divines did not likely imagine this to be regular. So what I'm left wondering is either A, how radical these revisions were, or B, if they were radical, whether the redactors fully appreciated the nuance in classical Presbyterian thought. But either way, I worry about how we, in successive centuries, have lost that nuance and succumbed to an increasingly secularist and separatist political theory that abandons our Presbyterian patrimony. To help us to address some sloppy thinking about these revisions, I'd like to appeal to a key critic of similar revisions to his sister confession. P.J. Houdemacher went to battle with Abraham Kuyper over the latter's proposed revisions to the article in the Belgic Confession about the civil magistrate. Houdemacher thought Kuyper and his colleagues were confused about the original meaning. He explains that an established church does not mean a ruling church, or that all who are in the nation are automatically in the church. He also argues that Kuyper and others like him are confused about the arrangement in the Old Testament. It is simply not the case, as explained earlier, that in Old Covenant Israel, the church had no independent existence, but simply coincided with the state. The Reformed rejected that Anabaptist and Erastian misreading of the Old Testament Israel. Thus, the intent to make a distinction between civil and ecclesial bodies is not a reason to alter the confessions. Furthermore, as discussed earlier, classical Reformed political theology always rejected religious coercion. However, to properly understand classical Reformed teaching on the harmony between establishment on the one hand and toleration on the other, we must understand the distinction between freedom of belief versus freedom of promulgation. Persons are free to believe as they wish privately, but not free to publicly attack the religion that is foundational to civil order. What is at stake in the confessional language is public expression, which is different from freedom of conscience. Absolute religious freedom is impossible if one seeks to have a society. Citizens have religious freedom subject to what is required from public order, the freedom of others, and the character of the nations and its institutions. One cannot use religious freedom to overthrow the foundations of society. And again, according to Houdemacher, echoing the classical tradition, says that some religion will inevitably be recognized as the reference for truth in a given society, and that such a religion will be distinguished from others. He elaborates, quote, freedom of religion is something entirely different from freedom of conscience. According to our confession, the civil government is to determine, one, which religion in the state is to be accepted into the commonwealth, and as such is to be protected and administered with public authority, and two, which religion will be allowed and tolerated, end quote. This is what the Reformed confessions on the civil magistrate and duties toward religion are about, public life. The issue to which the controversial clauses refer is grave heretics and obstreperous blasphemers that undermine the public order. Again, the point is public life, to prevent the approved religion from being slandered and thus jeopardizing civil order. Houdemacher is emphatic. Classical Reformed political theory maintains that public authorities and institutions can recognize true religion and the church without erasing the distinction between civil and ecclesiastical societies. Classical Reformed teaching does not put the state over the church. Rather, as nursing fathers, operating circa sacra, civil magistrates are concerned to protect true religion, but not authorized to rule the church or usurp the church's duties. And likewise, this teaching does not put the state or the church over the state. Rather, the state needs to hear the word, which the church authoritatively interprets. The church seeks to enlighten the state, to fulfill its duties, to enlighten, not rule. Classical Reformed political theology wants to free the magistrate to listen to the word, but the magistrate is not entrusted with the authoritative interpretation of that word, which is why the church is key. The state is accountable to the word, which the church is authorized to interpret publicly. The state is enlightened by the church to fulfill its duties. Hudemacher summarizes this classical Reformed teaching, quote, "The civil magistrate ought to accept the truth which the church confesses and the light which it kindles for the proper understanding of the word to the degree necessary to fulfill its vocation," quote, end quote. The magistrate must be enlightened by the public interpretation of the word by the church, and thus it must recognize the church as a divine institution that bears witness to truth. Finally, to conclude, I'd like to make a few brief comments about the American inflection of Presbyterian political theology, commonly referred to as the spirituality of the church. This mostly emerged as an explicit position in the 19th century, though it's argued its origins are earlier. There is much good in this. The primary thing it is trying to protect is to keep the focus of the church on its unique vocation, to safeguard the church's spiritual independence, and to ensure that the church carries out its mission in spiritual as opposed to political ways. But here's the deal. You don't need anything new for this. All of those concerns are already accounted for in classical Reformed political theory. And I think this new inflection of the tradition leaves out something vitally important in the classic exposition: the state's duties to God, true religion, and the church. This seems to be lacking, I think, because this permutation is particularly concerned with resisting the temptation of the church to get obsessed with current events and political issues. I agree. We should not, through institutional organs of the church, speak to every issue in contemporary politics. However, even Charles Hodge, a preeminent proponent of the spirituality of the church, recognizes that sometimes political issues do rise to such a level that religion must speak. Classical Reformed theology has conceived of this happening through the mechanisms of synods, speaking to extreme situations, especially when the magistrates inquire. I worry that some contemporary adherents of this framework, or frameworks like it, will absolutely rule out such occasions. But a question for today: can the church, through institutional organs, speak to widespread gender insanity and the mutilation of children? But even more fundamentally than such extreme occasions, Reformed theology has always argued that the state has a concern with religion. And surprisingly, Hodge also concedes this. He says that civil governments have to do with religion and that public morality is inextricably tied up with religion. Yes, Hodge, situating himself distinctly within the American tradition, rejects forcing citizens to pay taxes to support any particular church. However, we've already discussed how classical Reformed political theory does not view tax support as a duty in order to properly connect civil and ecclesiastical bodies. Hodge also diverges from more extreme expressions of the spirituality of the church position in that he condones Sabbath laws and the state suppression of public blasphemy. Furthermore, he says that America is a Christian and Protestant nation, and this is not simply because a majority of individuals believe, but because, quote, the institutions, laws, and official action of the government, whether that action be legislative, judicial, or executive, is and of right should be and in fact must be in accordance with the principles of Protestant Christianity, end quote. This is public religion, Presbyterian style, even by a preeminent expositor of the spirituality of the church tradition. As our society continues to reconsider the relationship between religion and the public sphere, meaning civil authorities and public institutions, I exhort us to attend to the rich, nuanced resources of our tradition and to think creatively and constructively about how classical Presbyterian principles could guide our political imaginations today. Prudence will dictate how we can apply these principles in our context, but let us not abandon them too quickly because their application is complicated. We have a deep tradition that provides us rich resources for political wisdom, and I hope we look at it. So, thank you.